He is known only by a whisper, the Black Pope. He wears no crown, occupies no gilded throne, and offers no grand benedictions to the faithful. Yet, many contend that his influence dwarfs that of the official pontiff in the Vatican. Within the fortified walls of the world's smallest state, a hidden authority operates, veiled by centuries of ritual, ironclad vows, and an unnerving quiet. Here, in the ancient stone passageways, pronouncements that can shift the destinies of empires and shape the very arc of human history are not broadcast for the world to see. They're breathed into existence. Have you ever questioned who truly wields power in the Vatican? Or why the title of Superior General inspires a fear more profound than that of the Pope himself? This is a tale with no hero in the limelight, only silhouettes moving behind the drapery. For ages, the world's gaze has been fixed upon the white papal throne, the center of the Catholic faith, which millions regard as the seat of God's emissary on earth. To believers, the Pope is a source of spiritual guidance, a defender of morality and truth. But very few are aware that a short walk from that throne, inside an unassuming building devoid of regalia or white vestments, resides a power many believe is absolute. This power is vested in the Superior General, the supreme leader of the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus. For centuries, this figure has remained hidden from public view. He does not bestow blessings, preside over great services, or deliver holiday messages from St. Peter's Square. However, according to unearthed documents, persistent rumors, and faint imprints in forgotten historical accounts, he may be the one truly manipulating the levers of authority within the Vatican. It is no mere chance that statesmen, military leaders, and even cardinals know him by a name that is both respectful and deeply unsettling: the Black Pope. This title is not derived solely from the Jesuits' dark robes, but from the shadowy influence he commands in utter silence. An authority that operates without a spotlight, yet is capable of directing the spiritual light of millions. His presence, or rather his enigmatic absence from the public stage, has long provoked a question that few dare to voice. Who truly commands the Vatican? And how has this diminutive nation, scarcely a square kilometer in area, managed to steer wars, governments, and the destinies of continents for so long? There is something about the official narrative that feels incomplete. There are missing chapters, documents that have vanished, and decrees made with no record of their signatory. And in the background of every murky event, the Jesuits materialize, silent yet indelible. Is the Black Pope simply a religious leader, or is he a key player in a concealed network of global power that the world has yet to comprehend? Tonight, we invite you to pull back that heavy curtain, to explore the genesis of the Jesuit order, and to reveal the hidden strata of nearly 5 centuries of secrets omitted from your education. If the Vatican is a spiritual realm, then the Jesuits are its elite core, not merely for their formidable intellect or unyielding discipline, but for their chilling, unconditional allegiance. The Society of Jesus was established in 1540, amidst the turmoil of the Protestant Reformation, as visionaries like Martin Luther began to dismantle the authority of the Catholic Church. The Vatican knew it required a force more potent than dogma, an organization prepared to fight not with supplication, but with strategy, knowledge, and, when needed, covert measures. The Jesuits were created by Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish nobleman and soldier injured in combat. During his prolonged convalescence, he did not surrender his weapon. He merely exchanged it for the Holy Scriptures. Though he had left the theater of war, he never forsook the mindset of a warrior. He proceeded to build a religious order modeled on a military command structure, with its own hierarchy, chains of command, strict discipline, and unquestioning obedience. Jesuit priests defy the stereotype of the quiet, secluded monk. They do not retreat into monasteries, but venture out into the world. They become fluent in foreign languages, achieve mastery in the sciences, counsel monarchs, and establish educational systems that span from Europe to the far reaches of Asia. They are soldiers on the battlefield of thought, skilled persuaders, missionaries, and strategists. They enter foreign realms not bearing arms, but with something far more formidable: intellectual prowess and unwavering commitment. The Jesuits rapidly became the strategic intelligence of the Catholic Church. They founded hundreds of distinguished schools globally, educating not only the devout, but also the ruling classes. Many of their pupils would later become statesmen, generals, and, on occasion, their adversaries. Beneath their plain black garments were intellects honed to a razor's edge. This combination of admiration and fear was fueled by their oath, a vow not only to God, but specifically to the superior general, the sole figure with power over the entire Jesuit order, a man whose authority could even supersede the popes. Once a Jesuit takes his vows, he ceases to be an individual and becomes a component in a clandestine apparatus that operates silently and with terrifying precision. Rumors began to circulate. The Jesuits were not just delivering sermons. They were engaged in espionage, orchestrating the downfall of governments and steering global politics. Perhaps these were mere embellishments. But if that is the case, why have they been expelled by over 80 nations throughout their history? From France and Spain to Portugal and China, entire governments came to view them as a covert menace. The Jesuits left no occupying armies in their wake, but they did leave behind influence. They did not annex territories. They captured hearts and minds. Their rule was not one of force, but of ideas, and ideas can sometimes be more perilous than swords. At the heart of this intricate system is the superior general, quietly growing his network, molding new soldiers, and commanding an empire that has no map and no borders, yet is everywhere at once. It was then that the moniker Black Pope started to emerge, not in public orations, but in the private dialogues of world leaders, within classified papers, and in investigations that were never fully concluded. In the majority of religious institutions, the leader serves as a figurehead, not the one crafting strategic policy. But within the Jesuit order, the superior general is vastly more than a symbol. He wields tangible power, serving as the central command of a worldwide operational framework. This is the reason he is called the Black Pope, not because he is in opposition to the White Pope, but because he inhabits a parallel dimension of power that is hidden, unscrutinized, and nearly beyond reach. The title of Superior General is not a recent fabrication of conspiracy theorists. It is a real, officially sanctioned position within the Jesuit structure that has endured for almost 500 years. What piques the curiosity of historians and unnerves global leaders is the nearly absolute authority this position commands. In contrast to cardinals or bishops who are accountable to the Pope, the Superior General does not require Vatican clearance to reassign personnel, extend his influence, or initiate what are termed special pastoral missions. Within internal Jesuit writings, his commands are treated by his subordinates as the direct word of God. This level of obedience is so profound that many liken him to a military leader from a bygone feudal age. The building where he presides, known as the Curia Generalizia, is located near the Vatican, yet functions with autonomy from papal governance. It serves as a global strategic center, processing reports from Jesuit outposts across the world, assessing geopolitical landscapes, and orchestrating educational and missionary efforts, as well as, according to some classified accounts, political influence campaigns in critical nations. Even more astonishing is the fact that the Superior General is not chosen by the public and does not require the endorsement of Catholics worldwide. He is selected in secret by a tight circle of high-ranking Jesuit priests, men whose identities and activities seldom make it into the public record. It is hardly surprising, then, that people have started to question whether this represents a democratic process within a religious body or a closed system of power where all decisions are made by an unseen few. Some historians describe the Superior General as the Pope's spectral advisor, as many pontiffs throughout history have either been Jesuits themselves or were deeply molded by Jesuit education. While one man extends blessings to the masses from a balcony in St. Peter's, another is in the Curia Generalizia, poring over intelligence from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and charting the next global maneuver. It is a machine, precise, effective, and unseen. The full measure of its power is difficult to chart. There is no map, no official count, no public ledger. But fragmented evidence from history points to one conclusion. The superior general does not just manage the Jesuit order. He orchestrates influence. From prestigious universities and philanthropic organizations to private summits where global policy is determined, the shadow of the Jesuits, and behind them, the Black Pope, is ever present. And that is what causes unease. The most formidable power is not the one you can see. It is the one you never see, yet controls everything. Shortly after their establishment, the Jesuits embarked on a mission that few religious orders in history had ever conceived. They seeped into the very core of secular authority in Europe, not through force of arms, but through influence. While other monastic groups withdrew into quiet prayer, the Jesuits strode into royal courts, academic institutions, and secret councils, the very chambers where the fate of millions was decided. They had no need for thrones because they had perfected the craft of swaying those who occupied them. The 16th and 17th centuries were a time of religious warfare and blood-drenched pacts between the church and monarchies. In the midst of this pandemonium, the Jesuits rose as unofficial counselors, spiritual guides, and royal confessors, always possessing the right words for the right moment. In France, Jesuit priests not only instructed at royal academies, but also served as spiritual mentors to the Bourbon dynasty, one of the continent's most formidable families. They understood how to transform prayer into a tool of statecraft and scripture into the dialect of diplomacy. In Spain and Portugal, where monarchical power was inextricably linked to the Catholic faith, Jesuits became the spiritual designers of overseas colonial empires. As Spanish galleons embarked on quests for gold, Jesuit missionaries were silently spreading their faith throughout the New World, at times blazing the trail, at times following the soldiers, but always being the last to depart. In Austria, Poland, and even Russia, Jesuits were far more than evangelists. They instructed the coming generations of rulers, princes, dukes, and even pagan nobles in philosophy, political science, and theology. They molded minds before they could ascend to power, embedding Jesuit ideology where it would have the greatest impact, at the foundations of authority. And when direct access to kings was not possible, they found alternative routes. They served as royal confidants, confessors, or private instructors to the heirs apparent. They did not need to be monarchs themselves. They only needed to be near those who would become one. This proximity alone was enough to stir apprehension in royal circles. Whispers began to circulate that when a king delivered a speech, one might be hearing the echo of a Jesuit's voice from behind the scenes. With their extensive network of schools, churches, and training facilities, the Jesuits did not merely establish an elite educational framework. They cultivated an entire generation of thinkers devoted to their worldview. Children educated under Jesuit tutelage matured into bishops, generals, and ministers, men who entered the realm of power with ideas planted long before. This ascent was not accidental. It was a methodical, calculated progression. The Jesuits grasped that to alter the world, one must begin at the source of ideas, and ideas sown at the opportune moment travel further than any law or army. In time, this quiet presence became a source of irritation for many governments. Some monarchs outlawed them, and some courts banished them, but they consistently returned because the seeds they had planted in the minds of the youth had already taken hold. And so, when the question of who truly directed the great game of Europe was posed, the answer was not always on the throne, but in the library, where a Jesuit sat in silence, book in hand, speaking not a word, while his ideas resonated in the secret councils of kings. In the annals of history, few religious bodies have been banished from over 80 countries and territories only to survive, and even to come back stronger, seemingly untouched. The Jesuits are the singular exception. This anomaly has prompted many historians to question whether they were simply a missionary order or a clandestine network of influence that empires felt compelled to challenge. The 18th century was the zenith of this suspicion across Europe. Royal courts began to perceive a force beyond their authority infiltrating politics, education, and even their militaries. There were no insurrections, no armed conflicts, only a presence, steady, disciplined, and nearly impossible to dislodge. In 1759, King Joseph I of Portugal, advised by his influential prime minister, Sebastião de Pombal, mandated the expulsion of every Jesuit priest. This was not due to heresy or religious disagreement, but because they had become excessively adept at shaping education and, by extension, the minds of the young aristocracy. Those who received a Jesuit education no longer submitted blindly to the crown. They interrogated power, thought for themselves, and sometimes prioritized their faith over the king's decrees. In 1764, it was France's turn. Under the reign of King Louis XV, the Jesuits were charged with operating beyond their religious mandate and were systematically removed from all state positions. Their schools were shuttered, and their property was confiscated. Curiously, no specific crime was ever articulated. The justifications were ambiguous, as if the monarchy was afraid of something it could not articulate but knew was profoundly real. Spain, Naples, Parma, and eventually even the Vatican itself followed suit. In 1773, succumbing to immense pressure from European monarchies, Pope Clement XIV issued a decree officially dissolving the Society of Jesus worldwide. This was intended to be their demise, but it was then that the truly strange part of their story began. There were no uprisings, no acts of violence, no forms of retribution. The Jesuits simply vanished, as if they had anticipated the blow. In many nations, they offered no resistance. They merely changed their attire, went underground, and persisted in their work of teaching, writing, and training new generations under different guises. Their libraries, brimming with strategic wisdom, were not incinerated. Some were safeguarded by noble families who understood that while the Jesuits could be outlawed, the ideas they had cultivated would survive any royal edict. Then, less than 4 decades later, in 1814, the Jesuits were fully reinstated by Pope Pius VII. This was not because their past actions had been pardoned, but because the Vatican had come to a critical realization. In an era of growing secularism and anti-clerical sentiment, no one could defend the faith as capably as the Jesuits. The lingering question is, how did an organization so widely condemned across Europe not only endure but return with even greater strength? Was there a hidden power shielding them? Or had they constructed a system so deeply embedded within the intellectual class, the ruling elite, and international networks that it had become impervious to surface-level political turmoil? Their mass expulsion did not diminish them. It made them more difficult to detect. No longer bound to specific monasteries, they became agile, adaptable, and prepared for any political change. They became an empire without borders, defined only by loyalty and intellect. And at the helm of this empire, the Black Pope continued to issue his commands in silence, unconstrained by Vatican law and unaffected by national boundaries. He remains the only leader in Catholic history to command a global network that was banned but never broken. There is a peculiar quality to history. The most enigmatic forces seldom engage in open conflict. They move in silence, like 2 subterranean rivers flowing beneath an unmapped city. The Jesuits and Freemasonry are 2 such currents, one veiled in religious piety, the other in esoteric wisdom. Both have profoundly shaped secular power, yet it remains ambiguous whether they are adversaries or merely different manifestations of the same force. Superficially, the Vatican has long denounced Freemasonry, branding it as heretical, atheistic, and morally relativistic. Multiple papal edicts have forbidden Catholics from joining, labeling it a betrayal of their faith. In contrast, Freemasonry, which is rooted in reason, science, and humanism, has frequently criticized the Church as archaic, tyrannical, and opposed to intellectual freedom. But a more profound paradox persists. Both organizations function in secrecy, are highly organized, have a global reach, and are often found orbiting centers of political, financial, and military power. This convergence raises unsettling questions. Are they competitors, or are they simply two arms of the same unseen influence? Some historians, and more than a few enduring conspiracies, point to a shadowy connection between the Jesuits and the Freemasons, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a period when monarchies were collapsing, revolutions were igniting across continents, and the map of global power was being fundamentally altered. There are whispers that exiled Jesuits, ostracized during their suppression, quietly affiliated with Masonic lodges, bringing with them their insider knowledge and organizational acumen, precisely what Freemasonry needed to broaden its influence across Europe and the New World. Both groups exhibit strikingly similar characteristics: secret rituals, hierarchical organizations, coded communications, and, most importantly, an oath of absolute loyalty to their brotherhood. These resemblances are too strong to be brushed aside as mere coincidence. As one scholar noted, if the Jesuits were conceived in the light of faith, Freemasonry was conceived in the light of reason, yet both understood that genuine power never operates in the open. One of the most fascinating points of convergence was post-revolutionary France. As churches were razed and clergy either fled or submitted, the Jesuits reemerged discreetly within intellectual circles, many of which were heavily shaped by Masonic ideals. There is indirect evidence to suggest that Jesuit priests served as advisors within certain secret societies linked to Freemasonry, especially in projects related to educational and social reform. While never officially acknowledged, the overlap of personnel and philosophy in these ambiguous zones has long perplexed historians. No official records confirm any formal alliance. The Vatican issues denials, and Freemasonry remains silent. But in historical inquiry, silence from both parties can often be more telling than any accusation. It is also crucial to recognize that Freemasonry is not a monolithic organization. It is a network of autonomous local lodges with differing levels of religious and political sway. In England and America, it frequently aligned with humanism and Enlightenment principles. In continental Europe, particularly in France and Italy, it became deeply involved in politics, sometimes working to undermine the Church's influence. And yet, even in those very places, the Jesuits never disappeared, sometimes acting as defenders of the faith, other times as silent observers in the background. Then there is the most audacious theory of all, that neither the Jesuits nor the Freemasons are enemies or even true allies, but rather two facets of a higher system of control, one that employs both faith and reason not in opposition, but in concert to shape the world. A system where the Black Pope is not the ultimate commander, but merely a single link in a much longer chain that history has lacked the vocabulary or the courage to identify. In the religious history of Europe, few words evoke a greater sense of dread than heresy, and behind that fear was a formidable apparatus, the Inquisition, where faith was no longer a path to redemption, but a blade suspended over those who dared to question. Yet, behind these merciless trials, few observed a figure who never appeared in public, but quietly influenced the course of it all: the superior general of the Jesuits, the Black Pope. The Inquisition had been in existence since the 12th century, but by the 16th century, it had entered a new phase of brutal efficiency, which coincided with the meteoric rise of the Jesuit order. The Vatican needed more than faith to combat the Protestant Reformation. It required a sharper instrument, a means to control thought and crush dissent before it could take root. And the Jesuits were the ideal force for this task. They possessed the intellect to identify subversive ideas, the educational network to reshape beliefs, and, most critically, a surveillance system that extended across the entire Catholic world. They had no need for soldiers or bloodshed. They simply dispatched discreet reports to their headquarters, where the superior general would review them and issue his directives. Not every Jesuit participated in interrogations or tribunals. That was not their function. Their power was rooted in something more profound: direction. They were the ones who authored the manuals that delineated the boundary between orthodoxy and heresy. They crafted the intellectual sieves in their schools, where even a student's innocent question could be interpreted as a sign of spiritual insurrection. And they, or more accurately, their superior general, governed the flow of thought at its very source. There was no need for prisons when he could control minds through internal communications and subtle, coded instructions that spread across Europe like a remote system of censorship. It was so effective that even those who were never accused of heresy became afraid to think differently. Some historians have suggested that your thoughts were not extinguished by torture. They were extinguished by a calculated silence. The Jesuits understood this principle perfectly. They did not need to interrogate. They fostered an environment where people censored themselves. In such an atmosphere, deviant ideas did not need to be suppressed. They simply vanished, not because they ceased to exist, but because no one had the courage to voice them. Some records indicate that many Inquisition proceedings were initiated by Jesuit reports submitted after lectures or private theological debates, where a remark made behind closed doors was later encoded and transmitted back to headquarters. There, the superior general would determine if a more extensive investigation was required. This was no longer preaching. It was intellectual manipulation. It was not about protecting faith, but about redefining it through unseen control. The Inquisition was the public instrument, but the long-term strategies, the conceptual frameworks, and the silent detection of spiritual dissent all carried the imprint of Jesuit methodology. And when such a system operates as smoothly and silently as a well-oiled machine, the one who orchestrates it from the shadows becomes far more menacing than any judge in a courtroom. The superior general never had to set foot in a tribunal. A single gesture from him, and an entire network of fiercely loyal priests would ensure that any dangerous thought was eradicated before it had a chance to flourish. The Vatican, occupying a mere 44 hectares, an area smaller than a typical golf course, remains a destination for discreet visits by world leaders, a place where intelligence agencies move with caution, and a focal point for billions of believers who regard it with either reverence or apprehension. In a world dominated by oil, finance, and military might, the Vatican stands as a paradox. It lacks a significant army, an autonomous central bank, and any natural resources. Yet it wields global political influence in ways that few can truly fathom. Behind its ancient, formidable, and silent stone walls, the official pope is not always the one orchestrating every move. Researchers, politicians, and even former members of secret societies have all alluded to this reality. There is a strategic mind behind the Vatican, a command center that operates with a colder logic than faith alone. And more often than not, that figure is the superior general of the Jesuits, the so-called Black Pope. In contrast to the Pope, who is required to appear before the public, face the media, and deliver speeches, the Black Pope remains concealed. He directs a vast and multifaceted network of universities, research institutions, charities, and international advisory committees, all operating under the guise of education, but discreetly collecting intelligence, cultivating influence, and forging connections with the world's political elite. The Jesuits are active in over 110 countries. They have no need for embassies because every chapel, every school, and every Jesuit university serves as a cultural outpost, a place where they not only teach, but also quietly connect with the local power structures. From South American presidents to Asian prime ministers, a significant number of leaders have been educated within Jesuit systems. And whether by deliberate design or mere coincidence, they often carry with them the philosophy, the discipline, and a sense of loyalty to the order that shaped them. In the realm of modern politics, ideological allegiance can be more lasting than military pacts. A single policy, a particular worldview, a quiet conviction, if instilled in childhood, can endure far longer than any formal treaty. The Jesuits are well aware of this. They do not merely teach literacy. They train the individuals who will go on to write the rules. The Vatican possesses no satellites, yet information flows to it without interruption. The Jesuits have no publicly acknowledged intelligence agency, yet in every classroom, charity, and chapel, there are those who are trained to listen, to observe, and, most importantly, to know who to report to. They do not need to violate laws. They simply need to be in the right place at the right time with the right person. And so, in those private, closed-door sessions where global strategies are formulated without any public acknowledgement, the name of the superior general may never be uttered, but his influence is palpable in the reports, in the data, and in the guarded manner in which others speak. As one researcher noted, the Vatican is the only nation that does not need to declare its power because every other center of power is already aware of what it possesses, and within that silent mechanism, the Black Pope never needs to step into the light. He only needs to ensure that every component functions in unison, from a schoolboy in Manila to a researcher in Boston to a priest in Buenos Aires. When action is required, he does not issue commands. He alters the trajectory of thought. In a world where missiles are less significant than information and ideology carries more weight than force, the Vatican, with its quiet, sophisticated system constructed by the Jesuits, has emerged as a true superpower of influence. It requires no borders, yet it shapes nations from the inside out. And that is why, in the private chambers of global summits, you will often hear a whispered question: who is with the Vatican? And who is listening from behind the curtain, dressed in black? The history of the Vatican is bathed in a hallowed light, but it is also cast in a quiet shadow, where death is not always a matter of natural causes, and the unexpected demise of a pope can cast the world into a state of stunned silence. On September 28, 1978, a mere 33 days after ascending to the papal throne, Pope John Paul I was discovered dead in his private quarters within the Vatican. There was no sound, no forewarning, no indication of any serious pre-existing health issues. He departed this world with a silence so profound that it bred suspicion, a silence that ignited a tempest of questions that continue to reverberate decades later. John Paul I was not a conventional figure. He was celebrated for his reformist ideals, his connection with the common faithful, and his explicit goal of cleansing the Vatican of its escalating political and financial corruption. But it was this very determination, according to numerous theories, that made him a danger to those with deeply established power. Among them, some have speculated, was a radical conservative element within the Jesuit order. In the days leading up to his death, John Paul I was reportedly on the verge of implementing a radical overhaul of the Vatican's financial system, with a particular focus on the Vatican Bank, which had long been suspected of involvement in money laundering, fraud, and connections to the Italian mafia. He also intended to dismiss several high-ranking cardinals, some of whom were allegedly associated with clandestine organizations like Propaganda Do, P2, a secret Masonic lodge that had infiltrated the realms of banking, politics, and even the church itself. The problem was that many of the key figures in these networks had either direct or indirect connections to the Jesuits. No one explicitly accused the superior general, but independent inquiries by journalists, historians, and even former intelligence officers all pointed in a similar direction. There's an unseen hand within the Vatican, a force that is never captured on camera, but is coordinating everything. On the evening before he died, John Paul I is said to have summoned a few trusted advisors to review a list of reassignments and dismissals that he planned to announce. That list has never been seen by the public. By the next morning, he was found without life, a book open on his chest, his spectacles still perched on his face. The official cause of death was declared a heart attack. There was no autopsy, no independent inquiry, and no comprehensive medical report. The matter was closed as an act of God. But for those acquainted with the inner workings of the Vatican, that silence was more deafening than any funeral toll. Years later, books such as In God's Name by David Yallop and A Vatican Connection by Richard Hammer attempted to penetrate this veil of secrecy. While they could not provide definitive legal evidence, they all converged on one point. Powerful, shadowy forces had determined that John Paul I's reign could not be allowed to continue. And among the potential suspects, the Jesuits, with their global reach, iron discipline, and subtle capacity to shape internal church politics, were frequently mentioned. There were no direct charges, but no one discounted their possible involvement. And so the question lingers, could someone wield enough power to bring down a pope? And if so, would they need to act alone, or simply give a signal and let the silent machinery handle the rest? In the shadowy realm of the Vatican, truth is never exposed to the light. It is only glimpsed in missing documents, disappearing evidence, and questions that no one is brave enough to ask. In any institution, the oath is the bedrock. It is the cord that ties an individual to the mission, the cause, and something greater than oneself. But within the Jesuit order, the oath is more than a mere ceremony. It is an all-encompassing pact, a metamorphosis of the individual into a conduit of absolute obedience. The Jesuits are renowned for having one of the most demanding training regimens in the Catholic world. To become a Jesuit is not simply a matter of studying theology or engaging in religious practices. It is a multi-year odyssey, a sequence of trials that are physical, intellectual, and spiritual. But at the culmination of this journey lies a final ceremony, the ultimate oath. And it is this oath that sets the Jesuits apart from any other religious order. In this solemn vow, a Jesuit pledges absolute devotion not only to the Pope, but to the Superior General of the Jesuits, a loyalty that is not symbolic, but literal and unwavering. His commands are to be regarded as the voice of God. Personal views, emotions, and even skepticism must be suppressed in order to achieve a state of complete readiness for any mission, anywhere, at any time. There is a passage, long disputed but frequently referenced by scholars, from a higher-level Jesuit oath. I pledge that I will have no will but that of the order, that I will travel wherever commanded, perform whatever is required, even if it entails entering cursed territories, infiltrating the enemy, or destroying the Church's adversaries by any means necessary. While the Vatican has never officially validated this striking text, internal training materials provide indirect support, manuals, that detail how to subordinate personal will and how to perceive the world, not through one's own eyes, but through the lens of the order. A central tenet is consistently reinforced, perind ac cadaver, as a corpse, signifying that one should obey one's superiors as a lifeless body, utterly compliant to another's will. There is no room for resistance, questioning, or personal interpretation. It is this mentality that enables the Jesuits to operate globally across different cultures, languages, and political systems. A Jesuit in the Congo can function in perfect alignment with a Jesuit in Canada because both have been indoctrinated with the same cognitive framework, bound to a single master, the Black Pope. And this is not merely theoretical. In practice, these vows have been put into action, entering active war zones, going undercover in hostile organizations, or carrying out clandestine missions that have never been reported in any official news outlet. Some have said that the Jesuits do not need prisons to confine people. They confine them with oaths that are enforced not just by doctrine, but by an internal system of surveillance where each member is conditioned to monitor themselves and report any deviation from the prescribed path. In such a framework, the Superior General has no need for punishment. He only requires a subtle gesture, a quiet directive, to prompt thousands around the world to self-correct, like cogs rotating in perfect unison. This discipline does not just build organizational cohesion. It generates a form of irreversible power. Each individual becomes a loyal node in a global network, serving a singular purpose and a single commander. And throughout history, any organization that can command such loyalty, regardless of its name, is not merely a religion. It is a system, a strategy, a component in a much larger game than any sermon could ever articulate. When the Spanish and Portuguese fleets first traversed the oceans in the 16th century, the world embarked on a new chapter, the era of colonial empires. But on every voyage, amidst the soldiers, merchants, and adventurers, there was invariably at least one figure clad in a black robe, clutching a crucifix, and carrying sacred texts instead of weapons. This was a Jesuit priest, entrusted with a mission as vital as the quest for gold, the conquest of souls. The Jesuits did not come to the New World to acquire land by force. They came to establish spiritual dominion through faith. In untouched lands, among forest-dwelling tribes and remote mountain communities, they erected missions, churches, and schools, gradually reordering indigenous life to conform to Catholic principles. In Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, they created self-governing communities known as reductions, where native populations lived apart from colonial society under the complete authority of Jesuit priests. On the surface, these were tranquil havens, free of private property and violence, filled with music, prayer, and learning, a Catholic utopia deep in the wilderness. But the question persists, a utopia for whom? While European empires were plundering gold and enslaving people, the Jesuits asserted that they were there to safeguard the dignity and souls of the indigenous populations. Yet, they too controlled immense resources: land, agriculture, livestock, and even the trade in valuable commodities like salt and exotic hardwoods. Some historians have characterized the reductions as functioning like miniature theocracies, self-reliant, strictly managed, and structured almost like an empire within an empire. Not all indigenous people embraced conversion voluntarily. Many were coerced through a form of gentle assimilation. Those who did not convert could not be saved, could not receive an education, and were ostracized from the divinely protected communities. It was a subtle form of mental bondage, more potent than any physical restraint. People were not controlled by force, but by beliefs that were carefully re-engineered at their very foundation. To the Vatican, the Jesuit success in the New World was a monumental achievement. They had not only disseminated their faith, but had also constructed a model society, demonstrating that religion could be the cornerstone of an entire civilization. But for the colonial powers, this model gradually evolved into a threat. The native communities under Jesuit guidance grew more prosperous and autonomous. And, most alarmingly, they pledged their allegiance to the Jesuits, not to the king. In 1767, King Carlos III of Spain, perturbed by the expanding influence of the Jesuits in South America, commanded their expulsion from all Spanish territories. Hundreds of missions were deserted. The indigenous people, who had lived for generations under the paternalistic rule of the Jesuits, were now forcibly integrated into imperial systems by military might. An entire social order crumbled. But the seeds of influence had already been sown. Before their departure, the Jesuits meticulously copied everything: documents, maps, records, and internal reports, and smuggled them back to Europe. It is believed that the superior general in Rome at the time issued clandestine orders to preserve the entire knowledge base of the New World missions, and some of these documents have never been made public. This reveals a deeper truth. The Jesuits were not merely purveyors of faith. They were guardians of secrets about an entire continent, secrets about indigenous cultures, hidden wealth, geography, and perhaps most crucially, the art of controlling the human mind. And those secrets, quietly archived for centuries, may still be informing strategies today, strategies that the world has never been privy to. While Europe remained captivated by the quest for gold and silver in the Americas, the Jesuits had already turned their attention to a more distant prize, a land that held no precious metals but possessed something they coveted even more: an ancient, proud, and self-contained civilization that was impervious to faith alone. That land was Asia. Unlike the newly discovered territories, China and Japan were well-versed in the dynamics of power. They had their own emperors, dynasties, writing systems, and intricate philosophical traditions. They could not be swayed by the Bible, as they already had their own revered texts. And so, the Jesuits adopted a different approach. They would enter not with crucifixes, but with telescopes, calendars, and knowledge. The first Jesuit to set foot in China was Matteo Ricci in the late 16th century. He did not evangelize in the marketplaces dressed as a priest. He mastered Mandarin, attired himself as a Confucian scholar, and introduced Western advancements in science, astronomy, mathematics, and cartography. He did not implore the Chinese to accept his God. He asked them to acknowledge the logic of the cosmos. And once he had gained their respect, he introduced his faith through the language of philosophy. This method, known as cultural accommodation, became the cornerstone of the Jesuits' efforts across Asia. They did not challenge local cultures. They infiltrated them discreetly, focusing on scholars, government officials, and even members of the royal court. In China, Jesuits were instrumental in helping the Ming court revise its astronomical calendar, forecast solar eclipses, and synchronize imperial ceremonies with celestial events. In a society where the heavens were a symbol of divine authority, this work granted them significant influence. For a period, Jesuit priests served as unofficial advisors, entrusted with the oversight of imperial observatories. In Japan, the journey was more arduous. Early Jesuits like Francis Xavier achieved some success, converting tens of thousands, particularly in the Kyushu region. But once the ruling shoguns recognized that this new faith could foster divided loyalties and bring with it European influence, the Tokugawa regime cracked down with brutal force. Christianity was outlawed, and a period of persecution began. But the Jesuits did not retreat, they went underground. Some lived in concealment for decades, secretly training believers and even dying as martyrs without ever disclosing the identities of their fellow priests. Their unwavering commitment earned them the title of invisible warriors of faith among Japanese converts. Despite the suppression, Jesuit ideas left a lasting impression. Concepts of God, salvation, and Western ethical philosophy began to permeate the Japanese intellectual sphere, planting seeds that would influence cultural reforms centuries later. In China, the Jesuits also left a profound legacy in the fields of cartography, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. But beyond the sciences, they left an ideological mark, a quiet but persistent presence in cultural decision-making. Even under the Qing dynasty, when Christianity was suppressed, Jesuit texts continued to be copied, studied, and circulated in secret among elite scholarly circles. More importantly, the superior general of the Jesuits, from his headquarters in Europe, was always informed about developments in the East. Detailed reports, maps, political analyses, and social assessments were all encoded and transmitted back to Rome. In many instances, he possessed a more nuanced understanding of Asian courts than most Western monarchs. There was no war, no conquest, no occupation. Yet, the Jesuits managed to embed themselves into the intellectual framework of two of the world's most ancient civilizations. And that reveals a fundamental truth. Their mission was not merely to convert, but to shape how a civilization perceives itself. If the history of religion were a grand theatrical production, some of its most intense conflicts never occurred in the public eye. They did not play out on blood-soaked battlefields or resonate through the pealing of church bells. They transpired in the stone-lined corridors of the Vatican, where prayers were replaced by memoranda, discreet meetings, and silent decisions that could alter the very destiny of the Church. Since its inception in 1540, the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, has always been an outlier. They were not monks seeking solitude or ascetic purity. They were trained to be strategists, educators, missionaries, and, at times, political advisors. This adaptability and their global presence soon made them objects of suspicion, not from external forces, but from within the Church itself, among the clergy. A powerful faction of traditionalists, who clung fiercely to hierarchical structures and doctrinal consistency, began to see the Jesuits as excessively adaptable, overly clever, and difficult to manage. The friction first became apparent in their missionary tactics. While other orders adhered rigidly to prescribed rituals and dogmas, the Jesuits assimilated local customs. They adopted the attire of Confucian scholars in China, used indigenous terminology to elucidate Christian concepts, and integrated local traditions into Catholic ceremonies. To the conservatives, this was not adaptation. It was a betrayal. They accused the Jesuits of promoting heresy, diluting divine truth, and using faith as a mere instrument of influence. But the core of the conflict was never solely about theology, it was about power. As the Jesuits expanded their reach across the globe, educating elites, influencing political landscapes, and molding the minds of future leaders, a sense of dread began to grow within the Vatican that the Superior General was discreetly constructing a parallel papacy, one that was not publicly acknowledged but was undeniably real. Some popes were openly wary. Pope Clement XIV, who issued the decree to suppress the Jesuits in 1773, was reportedly under duress from conservative elements in the Curia, men who could not tolerate a religious order that wielded more autonomy than most archbishops. At one point, there were even whispers that the Jesuits could influence papal elections through carefully nurtured relationships within the College of Cardinals or by mentoring key figures long before they ascended to positions of power. No concrete evidence was ever presented, but the questions persisted. The Jesuits, for their part, did not engage in direct confrontation with their accusers. They continued their work, their training, and their planting of ideological seeds. Their conviction was straightforward. That opposition would eventually subside, but ideas would outlast any accusation. Nevertheless, the underlying tension never abated. Behind closed doors, heated debates took place between the traditionalist faction and the Jesuit camp. They clashed on sensitive topics, such as liturgical reforms, the role of lay people, and the extent to which the Church should involve itself in modern political affairs. No side ever achieved a definitive victory. But in conflicts of this nature, the side that is more patient, more strategic, and more interconnected usually possesses the real power. For decades, the Superior General of the Jesuits played a long game. He did not appear at major public events, but his influence could be detected in Catholic universities, think tanks, policy centers, and nearly every arena where the Vatican could not afford a seed ground. Within the Church, the Jesuits have never been fully embraced, but they have also never been completely ostracized, because the reality is that they represent what the Vatican cannot publicly condone, yet cannot function without. When the First and Second World Wars engulfed the globe, the world descended into a maelstrom of fire and steel, marked by bombs, animosity, and the disintegration of empires. Superpowers clashed, governments toppled, and tens of millions were lost. But amidst the gunfire and turmoil, there was one entity that possessed no army, engaged in no battles, and was absent from any military map, yet successfully maintained its influence, its access to information, and its presence on both sides of every conflict. That entity was the Jesuits. No official record has ever confirmed that the Society of Jesus was directly involved in military operations. And yet, their presence throughout Europe, the Americas, and Asia, within both Allied and Axis territories, has led many to surmise that they functioned as discrete conduits for communication and as brokers of subtle influence, particularly during periods of transition. Before and during World War I, Jesuit priests ran schools, philosophical institutes, and missions across Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and even Russia. They carried no firearms, but they were the instructors of the children of generals, politicians, and aristocrats. Many high-ranking officers on all sides had at one time been students in Jesuit classrooms. The Vatican's official stance of neutrality enabled Jesuits to travel freely, transmit messages, and preserve quiet lines of communication at a time when ordinary channels were subject to censorship, interception, or destruction. Post-war accounts suggest that Jesuits may have acted as informal emissaries, conveying messages between opposing sides and even offering counsel to certain heads of state, always from a position in the shadows. But it was World War II that cast the Jesuits in the most ambiguous of lights. While the Vatican maintained a notoriously circumspect silence as Nazi Germany rose to power, many Jesuit priests in Germany forged a complex relationship with Hitler's regime. Some offered resistance and assisted Jews in escaping, but others were reportedly utilized to disseminate anti-communist propaganda under the guise of safeguarding Christian Europe from the Bolshevik threat in the East. In Austria and Poland, a significant number of Jesuit clergy were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Yet, some others were left undisturbed, continuing to manage religious institutions or teach under Nazi oversight. This disparity raised questions. Was there a dual strategy being quietly orchestrated from within the Vatican? After the war, as the Cold War began to take shape, the Jesuits re-emerged, not diminished, but strategically repositioned. Reports indicate that Jesuit networks were utilized by the Allied powers, especially in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Asia, where the specter of communism was a growing concern. The post-war superior general never appeared in public, but is thought to have maintained regular communication with the CIA, Vatican intelligence, and Catholic-aligned political factions in Europe. The substance of these communications remains confidential, but the outcomes are self-evident. The Jesuits not only weathered the war, but also expanded their global influence. Empires crumbled, borders were redrawn, and a new world order was established. But the Jesuits remained unscathed, unprosecuted, and unexposed. And this leaves us with a quiet but persistent question. Were they one of the few organizations that had a clear view of the entire chessboard and simply positioned their pieces judiciously on both sides? In the blood-soaked shadow of the 20th century, those who survived without bearing arms were not merely fortunate. They were the ones who had the keenest understanding of power. And in the long history of the Catholic Church, no one has understood power better than the Society of Jesus. The world wars concluded amidst flames, debris, and moral injuries of an unprecedented scale. Empires disintegrated, millions were uprooted, and faith in the established order was broken. As nations struggled to reconstruct their infrastructure and reestablish political authority, there was one organization that had no need for recovery, because it had never truly been defeated. It had simply receded to observe. And as the world began to embrace a new era, the Jesuits reemerged quietly, like a phoenix reborn from the ashes. The post-war 20th century was an epoch of Cold War tensions, consumer culture, and globalization. But it was also a period when power was no longer derived from land or weaponry, but from the control of knowledge, ideas, and educational systems. And in this domain, the Jesuits were masters. In less than 3 decades, the Society of Jesus had reorganized its global network. They reopened and updated schools, universities, and research facilities across the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Their curriculum was no longer confined to theology. It now encompassed social sciences, political theory, modern philosophy, and even technology. Catholic principles were no longer propagated solely through Scripture. They were subtly woven into the fabric of humanism, critical analysis, sustainability, and global ethics. The era of the lone missionary in remote jungles was over. In their stead were unassuming professors at international forums, policy advisors in development organizations, and strategists with Jesuit-trained minds serving in government agencies and academic institutions. They did not wear clerical attire, but they thought like Jesuits, committed to a philosophy that transcended national borders and political affiliations. It was during this time that the function of the superior general transformed. No longer just a spiritual guide, he became the global architect of the order's influence. Information streamed in from hundreds of Jesuit centers worldwide to be analyzed, compiled, and used to predict political, social, and cultural developments. There was no need for espionage or military force. Information was power, and the Jesuits grasped this concept better than anyone. In the 1960s and 70s, as the world was shaken by crises of faith, the Vietnam War, social upheavals, and the spread of Marxist ideologies, the Jesuits did not stand in opposition. They entered the fray. Many social reformers, radical intellectuals, and even revolutionaries had once been students in Jesuit classrooms. This was not a contradiction. It was a strategy. The Jesuits understood that to shape the new world, one could not remain outside the turmoil. One had to step into it and steer it from within. It was during these decades that a new perception began to form. The Jesuits were no longer missionaries. They were a global strategic institution. And perhaps this was not an inaccurate assessment. From the meeting rooms of the United Nations to the headquarters of NGOs, from Ivy League universities to post-colonial governments, Jesuit alumni were present everywhere. They were not dressed in cassocks, but they carried with them a structured mode of thought that had been forged in classrooms long ago. Serve, adapt, but never lose sight of the mission. And then came a moment of quiet but profound symbolism. In 2013, for the first time in Catholic history, the Church elected a Jesuit pope, Pope Francis, a former Jesuit priest, a man shaped by the poverty and injustice he had witnessed in the barrios of South America. To the world, his election was a signal of renewal. But for those who had observed the Jesuits for 5 centuries, it was the final, triumphant note of a long and patient campaign of influence. The student was now seated on the white throne, and in the shadows, the Black Pope remained. He did not court applause or appear in St. Peter's Square, but across continents, he continued to discreetly coordinate a vast network where seemingly disparate individuals still work towards a common vision of faith, strategy, and unwavering service. As the world transitioned into the post-World War II landscape, the map of global power was reconfigured not only in diplomatic chambers, but also in the clandestine world of intelligence networks. In the dense fog of the Cold War, where each superpower championed its own ideology, employed its own methods, and pursued its own goals, improbable alliances and unspoken collaborations emerged. Partnerships that no one would ever publicly acknowledge, yet were undeniably present in every strategic move made behind the scenes. Among the many controversial entities of the 20th century, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, and the Jesuits, a Catholic religious order dedicated to faith and justice, are 2 names that one would hardly expect to find in tandem. One operated with absolute secrecy, orchestrating coups, managing covert conflicts, and gathering global intelligence. The other was a religious order of educators, priests, and missionaries who professed to serve God in truth. And yet, this very disparity created a peculiar synergy, one that is not easily accounted for by simple logic, because both organizations possessed a unique characteristic: a global network, profound access to local populations, and the capacity to infiltrate society at its most elemental level. After World War II, as the United States came to understand that nuclear armaments could not win over hearts and minds, the CIA began to explore more subtle avenues of influence. And in this quiet theater of operations, the Jesuits, with their hundreds of schools, universities, churches, and NGOs dispersed across the globe, became an ideal partner. No official records establish a formal link between the two, but a wealth of testimonies, declassified documents, and the accounts of former agents and clergy indicate that this informal alignment commenced in the 1950s, particularly in volatile regions like Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa. In South America, where Marxist-inspired revolutions were spreading across the continent, many Jesuit priests were involved in community education initiatives, but they were also reported to have supplied intelligence on political developments, public opinion, and revolutionary movements. According to some accounts, the CIA secretly collaborated with Jesuit clergy to gather social data, assess political trends, and even coordinate anti-communist messaging through educational and religious institutions. In Vietnam, during the conflicts with the French and later the Americans, Jesuit missions discreetly served as centers for information exchange. With their deep connections to local communities, priests and Catholic laypeople were able to acquire critical intelligence from areas that were inaccessible to any foreign agent. They were trusted because they were perceived as men of faith, and that trust granted them access that even intelligence agencies could not obtain. In Africa, where the Cold War evolved into a competition for influence between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Jesuits established modern missions centered on healthcare, education, and humanitarian aid. Yet, Some former American operatives have since acknowledged that Jesuit centers often provided more dependable and unbiased reports than the U.S. embassies themselves. And there is another curious detail. Many senior officials in the CIA were educated at Jesuit-run institutions, most prominently Georgetown University, one of the most influential Jesuit universities in the United States. Both organizations purported to serve the community, oppose tyranny, and champion freedom. But the interpretation of that freedom was multifaceted and deeply ingrained. So, were the CIA and the Jesuits true allies, or were they simply two powerful entities moving in the same direction for different reasons? There is no straightforward answer. But from a strategic viewpoint, they shared a common and profound objective: the control of the human mind. One employed espionage, technology, and data. The other used sermons, education, and belief. But the ultimate goal was the same: to shape the world in accordance with a vision that each believed to be right. And in a world where conflicts are no longer decided by bombs, but by information, perception, and thought, those who influence how we think, feel, and behave are the ones who truly hold the power. If the CIA is the master of information, then the global financial elite are the masters of money. And in the contemporary world, there is no power more lasting than the one that controls both minds and money. That is why a question once dismissed as a conspiracy theory is now being considered more seriously. Could the Jesuits, with their global network and centuries of influence, be in alignment with, or even directing, some of the world's wealthiest families and corporations? The Jesuits have long been recognized for their intellectual prowess and strategic acumen. As early as the 16th century, they understood a fundamental truth: a religious order cannot subsist on faith alone. It must be financially robust, independent, and resilient. That is why they were among the first religious groups to make significant investments in land, education, and, notably, banking. From mission outposts in Latin America to universities in Europe and North America, the Jesuits quietly constructed a vast and complex web of assets, often sheltered under nonprofit status, yet intricately connected to major corporations, central banks, and private investment funds. Independent researchers have noted that many founders or senior advisors at powerful European financial institutions were either former Jesuit priests or were trained at Jesuit academies. Names like Rothschild, Morgan, and even certain discreet Swiss banking houses have had consultants and thought leaders with backgrounds in Jesuit education. In the United States, institutions like Georgetown, Fordham, and Boston College are more than just religious universities. They're incubators for political figures, financial lawyers, and global economic advisors. Many distinguished alumni have gone on to become hedge fund managers, central bank officials, or even finance ministers. But the true alliance is not just in education. It is in a shared philosophy. Jesuits do not simply teach people how to achieve success. They teach them to serve a higher cause, one that values order, stability, and a moral influence on society. For global elites who are constantly seeking a humanitarian facade to protect their wealth and deflect public criticism, Jesuit ideology provides the perfect silent partnership. That is why, in many countries, large-scale development projects financed by major banks are often supervised or advised by Jesuit-run institutions or their charitable affiliates. This collaboration fosters a new form of soft power, where finance and faith work in concert under the banner of philanthropy. There are global charities that build schools, feed the hungry, and provide aid, but behind them are banking entities that have been accused of market manipulation, money laundering, or destabilizing the economies of developing nations. So, who bridges these two worlds? Often, the answer is former Jesuit priests or individuals who have been profoundly shaped by Jesuit systems of ideological training. The Superior General, often referred to as the Black Pope, has never made a public appearance at a global financial summit. Yet, through think tanks, advisory committees, and the Jesuits' tightly knit international network, he is likely aware of where money is flowing, who is in control, and where to apply influence for the greatest social impact. This is no longer simply about religion. It is a coordinated global power structure where each financial decision can trigger a cascade of effects in education, politics, and even spiritual life. And in that game, the Jesuits may not be the ones making the moves in plain sight, but they are the ones designing the board. The elite may control the markets, and intelligence agencies may control the flow of information. But to guide the trajectory of an entire civilization, you need more than money or data. You need a venue, a place where the world's true architects of power can convene in silence, away from the prying eyes of cameras, beyond the reach of democracy, and shielded from public scrutiny. They are known as secret conferences. This is not a new phenomenon in modern history. Major global events, from financial meltdowns to presidential elections, from the collapse of regimes to abrupt changes in foreign policy, have often been preceded by private gatherings for which there are no official minutes and no public announcements. And yet, someone is always in the know, and certain shadowy figures are consistently seen in the background. The Jesuits are often among those who are whispered about in suspicion. They leave no public trail, but the discreet presence of Jesuit members or individuals trained in their institutions at Bilderberg conferences, the World Economic Forum in Davos, or within Vatican advisory committees has been noted. They do not wear clerical collars or claim to represent religion, but they bring with them a particular way of thinking, a method of operation, and, most importantly, a loyalty that is not to nations or political parties, but to a deeper, more ancient order. Many researchers have pondered why so many key figures in global strategy councils, from the IMF to NATO, have Jesuit educational backgrounds. Is it simply because they are exceptionally intelligent, or is it because they were selected? And if so, who is making the selections? One of the greatest enigmas surrounds unofficial meetings between religious leaders and the centers of financial power. According to a handful of insiders, these gatherings do not focus on theology or faith. They discuss matters such as how to maintain social stability during times of crisis, how to ethically manage media narratives, and how to sustain public trust as governments face a loss of credibility. And in these discussions, Jesuit scholars frequently play a pivotal role. They do not issue commands, they guide. They lead conversations with a logic centered on harmony, ethics, and stability. But is this really just due to their intellectual capabilities? There is a more clandestine theory, one that few are willing to articulate, that the Jesuits, or the Superior General himself, are not merely attendees at these gatherings. They may, in fact, be orchestrating them, not directly, but through a network of think tanks, NGOs, deep research institutions, and strategically positioned former insiders within global foundations. There are no contracts, no signatures, yet everything proceeds with a choreographed exactitude. Some of these meetings are held in ancient monasteries in Switzerland. Others take place at quiet universities in Austria, France, or Italy, where participants are only informed of the general topic, while the true organizer remains unseen. And after each meeting, there are no public statements, but the world somehow seems to have shifted. Who is it that sits in the shadows? Who remains silent while the world outside is in an uproar? Who never speaks, yet is heard by all? If you have ever encountered the saying, "Silence isn't ignorance, it's decision-making," then you may begin to grasp why the Jesuits never need to be in the spotlight to influence even the most brightly lit places. When a narrative becomes too expansive, too profound, and too verifiably real, the most effective method to make the public disbelieve it is to transform it into entertainment. It is a simple yet potent strategy, one that the modern media and the film industry have perfected over many decades. And when it comes to enigmatic power structures like the Jesuits, the Black Pope, or the shadowy networks operating behind the Vatican, Hollywood and the global mainstream media have never been mere spectators. Reflect for a moment. How many times have you witnessed hooded figures in dark robes roaming through ancient monasteries, chanting in Latin, participating in secret rites, or even orchestrating assassinations, vying for holy artifacts, and manipulating events for behind the scenes of religious power struggles? From the Da Vinci Code to angels and demons, from documentaries on Vatican secrets to fictional dramas alluding to a dark side of the Church. The Jesuits and Catholic secret societies have become standard tropes in popular culture. But herein lies the paradox. The more they are depicted on screen, the more the real-world questions about them are dismissed as mere fantasy. This phenomenon is known as the discredit through fiction effect, a communication strategy that has been widely observed by sociologists and psychologists. When a truth is too unsettling for the public to confront, allow them to laugh at it or enjoy it as a form of entertainment, and soon they will cease to investigate any further. So, who is the architect of this strategy, and who stands to gain from converting religious mysteries, power dynamics, conspiracies, and organizations like the Jesuits into cinematic plots? Here is something to consider. Many directors, screenwriters, and producers of major films with Vatican themes were educated at Jesuit universities or had academic connections to them. Institutions like Georgetown, Loyola Marymount, and Boston College not only offer theology programs, but also have top-tier media and film departments, and even provide funding for religious film projects. It is no mere coincidence that many so-called anti-Vatican films never push the boundaries too far. They may be sensational, but they invariably conclude with a message of reconciliation or obscure the true heart of the story beneath layers of supernatural fiction, romance, or outlandish conspiracies. And while the public is busy debating whether the Pope is concealing the Holy Grail or if Jesus had a secret bloodline, the genuine and far more significant questions are lost in a haze of imagination. Questions about the power structure of the Jesuits, the role of the superior general in global decision-making, or the Vatican's financial partnerships. Even in the age of the Internet, where information spreads with incredible speed, topics concerning the Jesuits or the Black Pope rarely penetrate the hidden filters. In-depth, thoughtful content is often demoted by algorithms. Channels that speak too directly are flagged, shadow banned, or quietly taken down, and original historical documents are presented out of context, robbing them of their credibility. Has the mainstream media become the perfect smokescreen? Its purpose is not to conceal the truth, but to obscure it, contort it, and ultimately make us forget it. Is there a hidden hand or a system that is carefully shaping the media to divert the world's attention from asking the pertinent questions? And if that is indeed the case, then the screen is no longer a reflection of reality. It is a velvet curtain that conceals a backstage where the true decision-makers never have to face the light. In every dynasty, the throne has always been the emblem of ultimate authority. At the Vatican, that throne is white, a sacred, pure, and divine presence that symbolizes the all-encompassing power of faith. To billions, the Pope is the head of the Catholic world, the guardian of canon law, and the voice of God on earth. But how many have ever paused to question if he is truly the one in ultimate control? Behind every pope is a tightly knit organization of cardinals, bishops, archbishops, monks, and theological experts. But deeper still, behind closed doors, within confidential meetings and off-the-record deliberations, there's a force that is seldom mentioned but is always present. That force is the superior general of the Jesuits, or, as many observers starkly refer to him, the Black Pope. Unlike the official pope, who is elected by the College of Cardinals and greeted with fanfare in St. Peter's Square, the Black Pope has no need for public adulation. He does not appear on balconies or bestow blessings. Yet, his influence quietly permeates every aspect of Vatican operations, from education and academic counseling to media strategy and global policy. Those who have worked within the Vatican describe the superior general as the intellect behind the scenes. He does not manipulate events openly. He simply sets the initial course, and the subsequent chain of events appears to unfold organically, as if following a pre-written script. Consider history. There have been popes who have resigned, most famously Pope Benedict XVI, who stepped down quietly amid scandals, pressures, and unspoken influences. Who advised him? Who created the unseen burden that led to his retreat? No one will say it publicly, but in the backdrop of that moment, the name of the Jesuits quietly emerged in numerous analyses. Then came a pivotal moment. For the first time in the Vatican's extensive history, a Jesuit was elected Pope, Pope Francis. This seemed like an ordinary event, but upon closer inspection, it marked the first time the white throne was occupied by a man from the most secretive order on earth. Was this a mere coincidence, or was it the culmination of a long, silent campaign of influence? A moment when the Jesuits were no longer just whispering from the sidelines, but had stepped directly into the spotlight. When the script is penned by the director, it is no surprise when the lead actor starts to bear a striking resemblance to him. The superior general remains hidden from view, but his people, his philosophy, and his carefully constructed network now occupy some of the most influential positions in the Church, from young cardinals educated at Jesuit institutions to academic councils, legal advisors, and media strategists. So, when the Pope delivers his message from the balcony, and the world listens in 50 different languages, who wrote the initial draft? That question may never be answered publicly. But the more we observe the Vatican's operations, its discipline, its secrecy, and its near-flawless efficiency, the more we begin to suspect that the light emanating from the white throne may originate from a source that is far darker, deeper, and infinitely quieter. Not all power needs to be seen to be real. The most perilous kind is the one that never reveals its face. And in the halls of the Vatican, where faith and strategy converse in ancient languages, the one who is truly in command is never the one in front of the camera. South America is a land of fiery passion, where the majestic Andes rise against the dense Amazon, and where the echoes of ancient civilizations can still be felt beneath the shadow of Christ the Redeemer. But it is also a continent that, throughout the 20th century, was repeatedly convulsed by military coups, dictatorships, and ideological battles between communism and capitalism. Global commentators have frequently pointed the finger at the CIA, Mossad, or Western economic interests for interfering in the politics of nations like Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Bolivia. But there is one organization that is seldom mentioned, yet its presence is ubiquitous: the Jesuits. As early as the 17th century, the Jesuits had penetrated the remote regions of Paraguay, Peru, and Brazil, creating reductions, isolated religious settlements. These were not merely missionary stations. They were experimental socio-political constructs where indigenous populations were brought under control in the name of spiritual salvation. And when the colonial empires fell and South American nations achieved their independence, the Jesuits did not withdraw. They simply adapted their roles. They became advisors, educators, and, at times, mediators during political upheavals. But from these vantage points, they also shaped the minds of those who would one day rise to power. In the 20th century, as the United States and the Soviet Union transformed South America into a Cold War battleground, many Jesuit priests openly endorsed liberation movements, Christian socialism, and the principles of social justice. They became spiritual allies to resistance factions, from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua to the FARC in Colombia. But here lies the paradox. The Jesuits did not align with a particular side. They aligned with a position. While some priests stood in solidarity with peasant revolutionaries, others were delivering lectures at elite academies attended by the children of military commanders and high-ranking politicians. This led many to question whether the Jesuits were truly impartial or if they were strategically positioned everywhere at once. In 1973, when President Salvador Allende, the world's first democratically elected Marxist head of state, was deposed in a violent coup in Chile, many observers noted that religious advisors were present on both sides of the conflict. Jesuit priests had supported Allende during his campaign, yet former Jesuit students were part of the coup's command structure. Similarly, in Argentina during the Dirty War, when tens of thousands were abducted or vanished, some priests were assassinated for speaking out, while others maintained a placid silence. And in the prisons of that era, confessions made to Jesuit clergy were sometimes utilized to discreetly identify political dissidents. How did the Jesuits manage to survive under both repressive regimes and revolutionary movements? The answer is rooted in their long-standing strategy, education, influence, and silence. They did not carry weapons. They trained those who would. They did not draft policies. They instructed the people who would. In the shadows of every coup, some offered prayers, and some observed in silence. But the Jesuits endured, continuing their work of teaching, writing, opening new training facilities, and even penning the biographies of key historical figures. Because for them, power does not reside in the bullet or the ballot. It resides in the mind. And ideas, once planted in the right place at the right time, will eventually blossom, even under dictatorships, even amidst revolutions. Every dictator has a genesis. Not all are born to a throne with a rifle in hand or with a presidential office awaiting them. Some emerge from poverty, while others ascend through the echelons of elite military academies. But here is the curious element. Many of them spent their formative years under the tutelage of Jesuit educators. This may seem like a contradiction. How could a Catholic order founded on the principles of service, humility, and education become the incubator for authoritarian figures known for oppression and control? The answer lies in the Jesuit philosophy of education, which emphasizes discipline, logic, critical thinking, rhetoric, and the art of strategic influence. In Jesuit schools, students are not merely taught theology or classical literature. They're trained to see society as a system that can be comprehended, molded, and directed. Consider, perhaps, the most renowned example, Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader of Cuba, who was educated at Colegio de Belen, a prestigious Jesuit institution in Havana. There, he not only honed his intellect, but also learned the power of disciplined organization, how to use words as weapons, and the profound allure of idealism. One of his former teachers once remarked that he was not just intelligent. He was acutely aware that he wanted to change the world. And Castro was not an isolated case. Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay, and François Duvalier of Haiti all attended institutions run by the Jesuits. Curiously, many of them maintained discreet connections with spiritual advisors even after they had consolidated their power. The more one investigates, the clearer it becomes. Dictators are not born as monsters. They're taught how to read a crowd, how to master public psychology, and how to create symbols of authority. And these skills, whether intentionally or not, were often cultivated in Jesuit classrooms, backed by 500 years of tradition. This does not imply that the Jesuits intentionally create tyrants, but they do equip minds. Some may use these tools for service, while others use them to dominate. Because every noble ideal, when placed in the wrong hands, becomes susceptible to manipulation. Imagine this. In a quiet classroom, a 14-year-old student learns the art of persuasion through language. Years later, that same individual stands before a crowd of tens of thousands, brandishing a rifle and proclaiming a new regime. But the power he commands is not just physical force. It is language, structure, and a mindset that was carefully shaped by Jesuit hands. And in many instances, when these strongmen encounter internal crises or external threats, they revert to their origins, seeking spiritual guidance or quiet counsel from the old networks of priests who once taught them and whom they still trust. No one can definitively state that the Jesuits set out to produce dictators. But the sheer number of authoritarian leaders who have passed through their institutions raises a profound question. Were the seeds of their power planted long ago, in an environment of silence, discipline, and a quiet reverence for authority, without anyone ever taking notice? World War II concluded with scenes of Allied triumph and the crushing defeat of Nazi Germany. But those who have a deep understanding of history are aware that many notorious war criminals were never brought to justice. Adolf Eichmann, Joseph Mengele, Klaus Barbie. These names did not perish in the ruins of Berlin. They simply vanished. And their disappearance was not a matter of chance. It was facilitated by a sophisticated escape network supported by organizations that no one would have suspected: monasteries, dioceses, and, most notably, a clandestine religious route that extended from Europe to South America. Its unofficial name was the Ratlins. These were covert pathways, often originating in Austria, Italy, or Spain, that passed through religious safe houses and led directly to destinations like Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, or Syria. The facilitators of these routes did not wear military uniforms. They wore clerical robes. In declassified records, the Vatican, particularly certain monastic orders in Italy and Austria, has been suspected of assisting in the provision of fraudulent documents, Red Cross passports, and even theological justification for mass murderers fleeing Europe. Notably, some members of the Jesuit order have been accused of providing sanctuary to SS officers, Gestapo agents, and German scientists before they were quietly integrated into larger networks, such as America's Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip, a mission directed by the CIA and its predecessors, was designed to bring hundreds of German scientists, many of whom had served the Nazi regime, to the United States to contribute to military and space programs. The U.S. was keen to prevent these minds from falling into Soviet hands. But to erase them from Nazi records, they needed a dependable laundering system. And the Vatican, with its capacity to issue humanitarian certificates and refugee passports, and its extensive network of monasteries across Europe, became the ideal conduit in this process. Many monasteries acted as temporary refuges, shielded by religious immunity. Some former Nazis, with the quiet assistance of priests or monks, had their identities altered, were nominally converted, and were placed on ships bound for the New World. A pressing question persists. Did the Jesuits, with their global network, clandestine operations, and significant presence along the Austria-Italy-Spain corridor, have a role in this? No official documents have publicly confirmed their involvement, but numerous witnesses, researchers, and independent historians have observed a pattern. Wherever there were secret movements of people, specially trained clergy were often in the vicinity. In South America, where hundreds of former Nazi officers found refuge, they were not greeted by underground operatives, but by local Catholic communities, sometimes under the supervision of priests who had been trained in Europe. Could all of this have been a series of coincidences? A chilling theory has emerged. In the view of some clergy, even a mass murderer could be redeemed if they possessed strategic value. If they could aid in the fight against communism or provide valuable intelligence, then helping them evade justice was quietly perceived as serving a higher purpose. But herein lies the fundamental issue. Who determines which purpose is sufficiently high? Who decided that Joseph Mengele was deserving of a safe escape, while the millions he murdered were not even afforded a name? Perhaps no one living can answer that question. But one thing is certain. The silence of the Vatican, and particularly of powerful orders like the Jesuits, was the very reason this network was able to survive and flourish for decades. Because once crimes can be concealed behind cathedral walls and conscience is redefined by strategy, then even the most heinous killers can receive a blessing if they know the right path. When we consider modern conflict zones, from the scorched sands of the Middle East and the blood-drenched landscapes of Africa to the fragmented states of Eastern Europe, we often think of international aid organizations, peacekeeping missions, or frontline reporters. But if you examine humanitarian reports, medical records, and relief logs more closely, one name appears with a quiet frequency that is more than you might expect: the Jesuits. How did a religious order, founded nearly 500 years ago to convert non-believers, become so deeply integrated into the heart of contemporary conflict zones? Are they there to save souls or to gather intelligence? Are they bringing faith or shaping the realities of the post-war world? From Iraq and Syria to the Congo, Venezuela, Afghanistan, and Myanmar, Jesuit-affiliated organizations like the Jesuit Refugee Service, JRS, are consistently present. They establish schools and refugee camps, provide medical supplies, and educate children who have been orphaned by war. This image is noble, humane, and undoubtedly true. But it is only a fraction of the full story. Behind these humanitarian efforts is an exceptionally disciplined network that is capable of embedding itself deeply within local populations, understanding diverse cultures, mastering native languages, and operating for extended periods without attracting undue attention. It is no mere coincidence that many intelligence agencies refer to Jesuit priests as the soft eyes and ears of the West, In war-torn areas where information is often distorted, media is censored, and governments are in disarray, Jesuit priests and brothers frequently become trusted sources of intelligence for multiple parties. Not just for the Vatican, but also for embassies, NGOs, and even national intelligence agencies. Perhaps their intention is not to engage in espionage. But when an organization offers medical aid, teaches children, and interacts with orphans, the elderly, militia members, and affected soldiers, the level of localized insight they acquire often exceeds that of any military unit. And when information becomes a precious commodity in times of war, those who possess it quietly influence the outcome. Consider Syria, for example, where Jesuits remained even in besieged cities like Aleppo and Homs. While most international organizations withdrew, some Jesuit groups stayed, providing medical assistance while monitoring humanitarian conditions. And soon, their reports, channeled through the Vatican, began to appear on the desks of European leaders. In the Congo, the site of one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises, Jesuits have done more than just open schools. They have facilitated reconciliation dialogues between warring groups. Once again, they have served as mediators, but mediators with their own distinct philosophy, curriculum, and at times their own political agenda, guiding the youth they educate. As the world enters a new phase of geopolitical realignment, with a growing resistance to military interventions, soft forces like the Jesuits are becoming increasingly crucial. They bear no arms, yet they exert enormous influence over the social and ideological landscape in the aftermath of conflict. This leads us to a challenging question. Are they simply motivated by Christian principles? Or are they spiritual engineers, discreetly reconstructing nations from the ruins? Perhaps the answer can be found in the Jesuits' original 16th century strategy: to infiltrate through education, to dominate through ideology, and to transform without the use of force. In an era where bombs no longer win wars, figures like them, dressed in black robes, with a gentle smile and a strategic mind, may well be the new form of power in postmodern warfare. In a world that is rapidly advancing through technology, a new kind of Cold War, and a deepening crisis of trust, few have noticed that the Jesuits are still here. Not with a loud presence, not with ostentation, but never having departed. And at the core of this vast, quiet network is one man who discreetly oversees nearly 16,000 Jesuits in 112 countries. He does not appear on television, he does not have a social media presence, and outside of inner circles, few are truly aware of his thoughts. His name is Arturo Sosa Abascal, a Venezuelan priest born in Caracas in 1948, who holds a doctorate in political science. He once taught at Georgetown University, served as the rector of a Catholic university, and, most significantly, was elected in 2016 as the 31st Superior General of the Society of Jesus. In this capacity, he is the direct successor to Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits in the 16th century. They call him the Black Pope, not because of the color of his skin, but because of the power he commands, a power that operates in the shadows, a power that is not defined by papal edicts, but by the authority to deploy, to direct, to shape, and, at times, to intervene. What sets Arturo Sosa apart is not just his academic credentials. It is his nuanced, almost elusive political philosophy. While most religious leaders avoid delving into geopolitics, he speaks openly about capitalism, social injustice, climate change, migration, and the intricate relationship between faith and power. Many analysts suggest that he is more than just a spiritual leader. He is an architect working behind the scenes, quietly reconfiguring the Vatican's role in the evolving global order. He is a priest who is fluent in theology, well-versed in Marxist philosophy, and a former participant in international research councils on politics, economics, and sustainable development. Fluent in Spanish, Italian, and English, and proficient in French, he does not need to speak frequently. A few closed-door meetings, a handful of internal memos, and the strategic education of youth through Jesuit universities worldwide are sufficient to shift social influence. Picture this: CEOs, scholars, and politicians across the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Many of them were once students at Jesuit institutions. They were molded by a philosophy of spiritual discernment, but they were also trained in service, leadership, and social strategy through the Jesuit curriculum. So, ask yourself, who truly shapes the future if not those who taught them how to think from the very beginning? And that is the power of a Black Pope. He does not need to be in the spotlight. He only needs to keep the system running, quietly, effectively, and constantly reproducing global influence through education, humanitarian work, philosophy, and politics. You may have never heard him speak, and you may have never seen his face in the media. But if you have observed shifts in global education, in how we define justice, or in the way young leaders are being shaped, then you can be certain of this. Behind those changes, there is a man in a black robe who is redrawing the world's map with intellect and an unwavering loyalty to the Society of Jesus. And so, the 21st century, no matter how technologically advanced, how AI-driven, or how globalized, cannot erase the influence of an organization that has remained hidden in plain sight for nearly 500 years. And the one leading it today is none other than Arturo Sosa, the Black Pope of our era. As the world crossed into the 21st century, many were convinced that the age of political religion had drawn to a close. The Crusades, popes with military might, and bloody holy wars all seemed to be relics of a bygone era. In the modern perspective, religion was expected to recede to make way for science, democracy, and a free market. But history seldom follows a linear path, and in the shadows of global crises, climate change, proxy wars, mass migration, poverty, and social injustice, religion is quietly making a comeback, not as pure faith, but as a more refined form of political power. The Vatican, with its unbroken 2,000-year perspective, seemed to have anticipated this resurgence before anyone else. And within the Vatican, the Jesuits, with their talent for strategic discernment and social maneuvering, have become the active agents of this return. They are not using guns or laws, but ideological influence, education, and the integration of religious philosophy into public policy. This new expression of religious power has become most evident in Latin America, where Jesuit priests are no longer just delivering sermons, but are actively involved in land reform, championing indigenous rights, and even engaging in dialogue with leftist movements. Religion is no longer an external force in politics. It has returned as a seasoned player with a new facade, intellectual, humanitarian, and strategic. In Africa, Jesuit-founded schools are shaping a new generation of leaders who are trained to be responsible global citizens. This is a commendable goal, yet beneath it lies a deeply Catholic sociological perspective that influences how these future leaders perceive the world, power, and justice. In Asia, particularly in the Philippines, South Korea, and even Vietnam, humanitarian organizations and social media platforms with roots in Jesuit networks are discreetly influencing political discourse. They do not disseminate propaganda, but they do shape values. And even in the Western world, where Catholicism was once considered outdated, religion is being rediscovered, not for its rituals, but for the spiritual stability it provides in a fragmented postmodern society. Young people are returning to churches not out of a sense of nostalgia, but because they are searching for something solid in an age of moral relativism and identity crises. Today's political religion bears little resemblance to its medieval counterpart. There are no popes adorned with crowns. It is more subtle, and perhaps more potent, because it does not need to seize power. It only needs to influence those who already possess it. And in that arena, the Jesuits once again find themselves at the intersection of ideals and authority. With their global network, timeless intellect, and ability to permeate every stratum of society, they have no need for flags or armies. They only need young minds that believe they are changing the world for the better, without ever questioning who defines what better means. Political religion has not returned through grand entrances. It has slipped back in quietly through classrooms, conferences, social media platforms, climate policy discussions, global forums, and humanitarian foundations. And like an unseen wind, it circles back to the center of the Vatican, where a white pope advocates for climate justice, and a black pope silently drafts the spiritual blueprint for the world to come. We were raised on textbooks. Each page represented a lesson, a timeline, a noble figure, all curated, vetted, and approved by official educational bodies. But it is for this very reason that what is omitted from the textbook often holds more significance. Because real history, the deeper, darker, and sometimes more perilous version, seldom fits within the confines of what is permitted to be taught. And if there is one name that appears only faintly, if at all, in those textbooks, it is this: the Jesuits. Despite their central role in education, politics, and religion for nearly 5 centuries, the Jesuits are rarely examined in any significant detail in public school curricula. Why is this? Perhaps because their influence is too intricate, or perhaps because their quiet power does not lend itself to a 45-minute lesson. But the true reason may be more straightforward. They do not want students to ask too many questions. No one points out that many of history's most powerful dictators received a Jesuit education. No textbook clarifies that global magnates frequently provide funding for Jesuit institutions. No curriculum discloses that global summits on finance, technology, and religion still quietly involve Jesuit observers or advisors. Textbooks do not mention that during the colonial era, the Jesuits served as intermediaries between European courts and indigenous civilizations, not just through faith, but through intelligence, cartography, and, at times, strategic negotiations. They did not just preach, they reported, analyzed, and remembered. No one tells you that many of the conspiracy theories that swirl around the Vatican, involving banks, post-war migration networks, and media control, often feature at least one figure with a Jesuit education. They do not need to hold high office. They just need to be in the room at the critical moment. We study the world wars in school, but rarely learn about the role of Jesuit priests in resistance movements, in post-war reconstruction, or in safeguarding the secret escape routes tied to Nazi Germany, the ones that are now referred to as Operation Paperclip or the Ratlins. Mainstream history celebrates scientific advancement as a victory of modern reason, but neglects to mention that many of the world's most influential thinkers, physicists, and philosophers, from Descartes to Teilhard to Chardin, were shaped by Jesuit thought. This means they did not just think scientifically. They thought within a deeper metaphysical context, one that today's students are never taught to identify. The truth is, these ideas could be taught. But if they were, students might begin to ask who writes the textbooks, who determines which chapters are included, who sanctions which knowledge becomes official, and which truths are suppressed. And those are the very questions that established systems do not want students to ask. We are taught to remember Galileo as a symbol of the conflict between science and the church. But few are told that Jesuit scholars were the ones who initially protected him, that the priests in the Vatican observatories were not the ignorant men we often envision, and that the clash between religion and science was far more complex than we have been led to believe. Because, as an old Jesuit manuscript once stated, knowledge without direction can become a double-edged sword. But when properly guided, it becomes the greatest tool for shaping the world. And so, you see, it is what is not in the textbook that is often the most important thing to read. From the Middle Ages to the modern era, religion has always presented 2 faces, one sacred, oriented towards God, and one secular, oriented towards power. And when an institution embodies both faith and the control of information, wealth, people, and strategy, one must ask, where is the boundary between belief and power? And who is monitoring that boundary? For the Jesuits, a group that has been expelled from over 80 countries, yet has continued to survive, expand, and embed itself more deeply within global power structures, that question becomes even more pointed. They preach humility, yet they operate like a superpower. They engage in daily prayer, yet they oversee dozens of universities, hundreds of research centers, and an unofficial intelligence network that spans 4 continents. We are conditioned to think of religion as a sanctuary for the soul. But when religion manages human data, shapes minds, influences policy, and commands multidisciplinary knowledge, It is no longer just saving souls. It is shaping history, and that is where the line begins to blur. When a superior general can influence universities around the world, from Georgetown in the U.S. to Sophia in Japan to Cumulus in Spain, and those institutions go on to produce future presidents, ministers, and CEOs, is that missionary work, or is it strategy? When Jesuit priests serve on advisory boards at the United Nations, addressing humanitarian issues, climate change, education, and environmental policy, are they serving God, or are they becoming the moral directors of the planet? And when the Jesuits do not hold public office but still advise the Vatican, world governments, and even transnational financial corporations, what kind of power is truly shaping the world? Few are aware of this, but the traditional Jesuit oath includes a vow of absolute obedience to the Pope, even in ambiguous matters. And yet, paradoxically, no religious order has had more friction with the Vatican than the Jesuits. They were dissolved in 1773, only to be reinstated in 1814. And with each return, they came back stronger. This raises a deeper question. Can faith remain pure when it becomes a tool to maintain influence? And can power remain sacred when it depends on silent, unchecked networks? The Jesuits are not demons, but they are not mere angels either. They are a global order that is built on belief, trained through intellect, and managed like a sophisticated strategic machine. And in an age where power is dispersed across technology, religion, finance, AI, and emerging ideologies, the Jesuits are positioned at the crossroads of them all. The question is no longer whether they have power. It is who controls that power, and more importantly, can anyone? When an organization carries both the cross and the compass of influence, the line between faith and dominion is no longer a straight path, but a labyrinth. And inside that labyrinth, much of the world moves forward, unaware of who is leading them. Every empire has its monarch. Every religion has its high priest. Every system has its architect. But in today's world, where religion, finance, technology, and academia converge to create a new form of power, one final question becomes more chilling than ever. Who is truly in control? We see presidents, CEOs, and religious leaders on our screens, but are they genuinely at the center of power, or are they merely the public faces for something deeper, older, and far more silent? Deep within the Vatican, there are doors that are not intended for public access. At the highest levels of the academic world, there are theories that are never spoken aloud. And in the heart of the modern age, where data, beliefs, and dreams are manipulated on a daily basis, a quiet question continues to echo. Do we really know who is making the decisions? In tracing the story of the Jesuits, from their stringent oaths and hidden influence to their exile, resurgence, and vast network of education and politics, one truth has become apparent. They never vanished. They adapted. They concealed themselves in plain sight. And, at times, they stood at the very center of it all, without ever leaving their signature. They have been called God's soldiers, but perhaps they're the quiet architects of a world that no one dares to name. A world shaped not by war or violence, but by thought, structure, and the power to persuade an entire generation of leaders that they are fighting for justice, without ever prompting them to ask who defines that justice. The Black Pope, an unofficial title, absent from any religious charter, yet spoken with a hushed reverence. No one elects him in a democratic process, yet his influence extends beyond that of many heads of state. When a man requires no public persona, no campaign, and no social media presence, yet still shapes the direction of global education, media ethics, and humanitarian policy, then perhaps he is the one who wields true power. You may live your entire life without ever hearing his name. But if you have studied at a Jesuit school, been influenced by Catholic social teaching, or subscribed to a vision of a just and ideal world, then perhaps you have already heard his whisper. It is not a voice that declares, "I rule," but one that gently asks, "Are you certain that you are the one who is choosing?" In a world that is saturated with data but starved of truth, filled with faith but lacking in guidance, the answer no longer seems to matter. Only the question remains, quiet, persistent, and never printed in a textbook? Who truly governs the world we inhabit? And more hauntingly, when did our faith become their instrument? This concludes our exploration into the mysteries surrounding the Jesuits, the Vatican, and the unseen throne in the shadows. A place with no crown, yet with the power to rewrite history without shedding a single drop of blood. If you found this journey to be thought-provoking and wish to continue delving into the hidden layers of history, the untold enigmas, and the stories that were never meant to be heard, then be sure to subscribe to Bedtime History. It is a small gesture, but it is the key to unlocking deeper, more distant, and sometimes more perilous narratives.